Now let's talk about ZBrush and ZTools, how to import ZTools, how to import OBJs to make ZTools, and the difference between ZBrush primitives and polymeshes. So we'll start with the ZTool menu here. This is where you go to load in an existing ZTool or to import an OBJ file or a Maya ASCII file and make that into a ZTool. So the simplest way to load up a tool is go to the Load Tool menu, and then you can open up any particular tool that you want, and you'll see it becomes the active tool here. There we have loaded in the beast head. That has been loaded. We could also load in a different tool. Now watch what happens. If I load in Orc Posed, it will replace the beast. You see that we have now replaced that tool. However, here, the beast is still there in our tool palette. So as we load new ZTools, they just replace the active tool, and then the previously active tool is still here in the palette. So I could come over here and grab the beast again. He's at a different orientation, so I have to move him into the screen. And there he is again. I can make a change to this model. Let's make a really obvious change. And if I come over here to the orc, start working on the orc, come back to the beast is still there with the changes that I made. And if I undo, the undo history for that the particular object is intact. So it's not stuck thinking about the undos on this one. The undos for each ZTool are discrete. So if I come back to the orc here, I can undo what I changed here. There we are. So loading ZTools is very simple. ZTools are going to differ from projects. Here we have File, Save As. This is where we save our projects. Project files save everything that's currently open in ZBrush. That includes every ZTool that you have loaded at this time. All the textures, all the alphas, everything that's loaded in will save in a project file. It will even save your entire undo history. Now, that's desirable in a lot of cases, but sometimes people want a smaller, more streamlined file type. In that case, they'll save just the ZTool. Now, if I save a ZTool, it is only going to save the current tool that's on my screen right now, any subtools associated with it, any textures, any displacement or normal maps. Those things will save with a ZTool. All these other ZTools will not. So that's an important distinction to understand. The default save, again in ZBrush, is Control-S. That saves a project file, ZPR. Saving under the ZTool menu saves a ZTL. Now, if you've got an object to bring into ZBrush, turn into a ZTool, what we'll do is select the Polymesh 3D star. This is just your generic empty ZTool. It's just a generic polygon star. I use this when I need to import an OBJ from outside of ZBrush or a Maya ASCII file. I go to the Tool menu and I go to Import. From Import, I can then browse to a file that I want to load. Here I will open up full body male mesh.obj, and that has now been brought into ZBrush. This was an OBJ file created outside of ZBrush. This was a generic file made available from Pixelogic. These are loaded in as OBJs, and now they are ZTools. I am able to divide, to add geometry. I am able to sculpt. I am able to move things around, paint textures, and then save as a ZTool. So importing an OBJ will turn it effectively into a ZTool. Now, in addition to ZTools that you load into ZBrush and OBJ files you import in, if I click on the ZTool palette here, you'll notice it's broken up into 3 sections. I have the Quick Pick section, which represents the most recently loaded ZTools. I have the 3D Meshes menu, and then I have the 2.5D brushes. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is the third section here, the 2.5D brushes. I mentioned in the Quick Start and in the interface lessons that 2.5D was the original basis of ZBrush. It was an illustration tool that did 2.5D illustrations. That's changed over time. It's still completely capable of doing it, but most of us use it as a sculpting tool and a design tool, and we render out of ZBrush. However, they need to maintain backwards compatibility, and these brushes here are from the 2.5D uses of ZBrush. You will rarely, if ever, find yourself using these brushes. There are some specialized tools and techniques where you might create an alpha on your canvas, sculpting it by hand using these brushes, but the chances are extremely high that you just won't find yourself using these brushes. It's fine to not become overwhelmed with these. Now, these are meshes. So it's interesting that the Z tool menu contains both meshes and brushes. So just disregard these brushes. They are not at all like these brushes here. These brushes are intended for sculpting on a 3D model in edit mode. These brushes are only able to sculpt on the canvas. They sculpt on a 2.5D image, basically a flattened image on your document window. Now, these 3D meshes, these, for the most part, are ZBrush primitives, with the exclusion of these Z tools that we've loaded in. But things like these primitives here, the sphere 3D, the cube, the cylinder, the cone, these are all ZBrush primitives, and these are quite useful when you're creating basic parts for maybe a hard surface model or a prop. I often find myself using things like this. So, for example, we can grab the Ring 3D tool. Here we have the Ring 3D tool. Now look, if I try and sculpt on it, it says to enable sculpting, please convert the 3D primitive to a polymesh. So what this means is a 3D primitive in ZBrush is not yet sculptable. It's still sort of a procedural object. If we go to the tool menu down here at the bottom, these primitives have an extra menu called Initialize. So if I open this, you can see I have a whole bunch of different options for the creation of this particular tool. It's quite similar to when you draw a primitive in Maya, and you can open up the attribute editor and change the options on it. Here we can do the same. I can change the scale. Look at that. I can change the radius. I can change the coverage. It's a nice way to make a little horn. I can change the divisions in both directions. I can even twist it. That's not going to be necessarily apparent unless we turn on frame mode. I can also change my alignments to X, Y, or Z. Now, when I'm ready to make this sculptable, I come up here and click Make Polymesh 3D. Now watch what happens. This is my current Ring 3D primitive. If I click Make Polymesh 3D, look how a new one appears that's called PM3D Ring 3D. PM3D means Polymesh 3D. A Polymesh 3D is a sculptable mesh. So if you find yourself wanting to create things using the polymeshes, then you're going to have to turn, or using the ZBrush primitives, you're going to have to turn them into a polymesh at some point or another. So we come back to the Ring 3D. I'll come back here and I will change my settings here. There we go. And I'll change my radius. Now if I want to use this as a chain link, I will need to make it a Polymesh 3D. And now as a Polymesh 3D, I'm able to duplicate it using transpose, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. I'm able to sculpt on it. I'm able to do all these edits, which would not otherwise be possible. There we go. So we've made a little bit of a chain link there just using ZBrush primitives. It's a little bit off center there, so what I will do is I will mask that one. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my polygroups. I will auto group. That will group each separate object separately. I will hide those two, mask those, and then I will show all again. To mask, I will just Control-click on the background and everything that's visible is masked. And then I will scoot those chain links up. There we go. Now we've got a nice length of chain. I could further extend it just by Control-Alt-clicking and dragging when I'm in transpose mode. And again, we'll look at that in our transpose section. So it's quite powerful to use these ZBrush primitives. If I go here and then select a ZBrush cube, I can come down here to initialize. I can change my size in the Y direction. I'll change my size in the X direction. Then I will go to Make Polymesh 3D. Now I have a 3D polymesh for that plane. So I can come back to my chain link, go to Subtool, and then append that new plate in. And I will recognize it because it is not the Cube 3D, it is the PM 3D cube. And there we have it right there. I can just take my transpose line. I can then move the chain away from my plate. And if I want to do one more link connecting, I can do that quite easily just by appending a ring. Now watch what happens. If I append a ring directly into my subtool stack, it is automatically converted into a sculptable polymesh. So I'm now able to rotate it and move and sculpt it like I would any other 3D object. So we can bring that out there. And there we have a bar with a link for our chain. So the ZBrush primitives are quite powerful. Don't overlook them when you're trying to create certain types of shapes. Another thing that I find useful, I can show you how to make a spiral horn. If we go to the Spiral 3D, use this ZBrush primitive, come down here to initialize. If we use the displace option, we can push it out. We can reduce our radius. We can change our thickness. And our coverage, we can make it shorter. There we go. Or give it fewer curves. And now we've got quite a nice horn there. Again, make Polymesh 3D. That is now a Polymesh 3D horn. So let's come back to our beast here. And maybe we want to add another horn to our beast. We'll go to the orc and give our orc horns. I will go to my subtool palette and append to add a subtool in. Now remember, in our tool palette here, we don't want the Spiral 3D. We want our polymesh that has been edited, the PM3D spiral right there. We can now select that subtool and we can make our changes to it. So in this case, we're going to scale it down. If something's quite large like this, you can come to the tool menu and go to deformation and just use the size slider here. It's sometimes faster to scale things down using the size slider. We can now move this using transpose and rotate it into position. And just like we did our eyeballs in our quick start, if I go to Z plugin, Subtool Master, Mirror, we can mirror that horn across the x-axis. And there we go. We've got a pair of horns on that character. And if we wanted to further manipulate them, just turn on your X symmetry, and that's easy enough to do. So that's how we work with ZBrush primitives, ZTools, and OBJs inside of ZBrush. In a later lecture, we're going to be talking more specifically about importing OBJ files, setting them up for sculpting, and then creating a character from them. So there's quite a bit more to talk about in that regard, but this is a nice overview of all the things that are available to you in terms of ZTools, OBJs, and ZBrush primitives.